friends, welcome back to my Pottery at Home series. This is the series that I answer some of your most frequently asked questions and give you all the information that you need to know about doing pottery at home. So in this video, I'm finally getting around the long-awaited video of water systems. So I'm going to teach you how you deal with clay and with water and with dirty clay water in your studio. So let's get into it. So I have 3 water systems that I've implemented in my studio, and these systems I've evolved over many years with the focus on 2 things specifically, and that is simplicity and sustainability. So I want to make my systems as few and as simple as possible because I don't want to be spending all my time maintaining my studio. I want to be in here working. And then a huge part of my whole studio ethos is to make my studio as sustainable as possible. If we are going to be producing products, if we're going to be producing more material objects for this world, let's try and reduce the waste as much as possible. Let's try and reduce our carbon footprint as much as possible. So I like to implement that ethos by just reducing the amount of water waste as much as possible. So that's the 2 focuses of my systems. Now let's get into the first system, which is reclaim. So here we are in this sort of reclaim part of my studio. So originally I was going to cover reclaiming also in this video, but I really think that warrants its own separate video. So stay tuned for that, that's coming up. But I want to show you at least the system that I have set up for the reclaim because this is probably the biggest part of my water system. So right behind me here, I have my dry clay waste. So I have my trimming pieces, I have, old coils that got dried out. Whatever clay waste that I make, I'm going to put it in here. So this is the clay that's like more on the dry side of the clay that I would be working with. Even if it's still quite wet, I'll just throw it in here. I like to have these fairly shallow bins so that, there's a lot of surface area so that they can dry out. And I do separate them somewhat. I have some, mixed clay in here. So I'm mixing my clays a lot. I really like to, mix the store-bought manufactured clays to create, a unique one-of-a-kind clay for my pots. So I am pretty loose about throwing which clay in with which. But if you do want to keep them as true as possible to the clay that you buy, you definitely want to have separate bins for each of your clays that you use. And that goes along with your reclaim bucket. So I have this bucket here. This bucket is just for reclaiming. And I never clean this because I don't mind if my clays mix. But yeah, again, if you have a red clay and a white clay and you want to keep them separate, you're going to need 2 buckets. Okay, and then over here I have my wet clay reclaim, right? So this is anything that's too wet to use. So this is the dry stuff, this is the wet stuff, and the normal stuff I just wedge up and reuse immediately. So this is basically made up of my throwing water. If I empty out my splash pan, I put it in here. Whatever's wet, basically, that's 100% pure clay water. So it's not my cleaning bucket. My cleaning bucket is not going in here. My mop bucket's not going in here. This is just my throwing bucket and things that I know are just pure clay water because I don't want nasty stuff getting into my reclaim. So what I'll do is I will take my bucket here, I'll pour in the dry stuff, I'll pour in the wet stuff, and I'll let it sit, and then that becomes my reclaim. And I'll definitely go into more detail later in the reclaim video, but I really like to do it this way instead of throwing everything into one bucket. I actually think it's easier. I know some people just throw everything into one bucket. I think it's easier to do it this way. And I'll explain why in my reclaim video. So there's a little teaser for you. Okay, let's move on to the glaze waste system. So for my glaze waste, the first thing I want to say is I do try to minimize my glaze waste as much as possible. And by glaze waste, I mean the very glazy water that you end up with. So it can be old glazes, it can be glaze that you've wiped off from the bottoms of your cups. I do really want to encourage you to try and use up your glazes so you're not just going to throw half of a glaze away. Personally, I think it's a fun, creative challenge to just try and figure out, use your creativity to try and figure out a piece that it would look nice on. Or you can use it as a liner glaze in like a vase or a cup or something like that. So try and use up your glaze. Try and limit the amount of glaze waste as much as possible, because this is the most toxic output that we're going to have. So we do want to limit our glaze water waste as much as possible. So for me, most of my glaze waste comes from wiping the bottoms of my pots. One way that you can limit the amount of glaze waste that you have from that is by waxing your bottoms, because then the pot will pick up less glaze as you dip it in. This is something that I've never really been able to establish into my workflow. I still just use water to wipe the bottoms of my pots. Let me know what you do and if you feel strongly about it, but for me, I just cannot bring myself to buy wax, apply wax, and then wipe it again. Like, you'd have to wipe it anyway, so. Okay, but even if you are waxing the bottoms of your pots, you're still gonna wipe off a little bit of glaze waste. So everyone's gonna have a little bit of glaze waste. Here's what you do with it. So typically mine ends up like this. So I've got a bucket of water with a little sponge in it, and the glaze waste is in there. This obviously cannot go down the drain. Similar to clay, it's going to clog up your drain, but also glaze waste does have these chemicals in it that you really don't want to add to the water supply. Nor do you want to bag it up and put it in the landfill. This is something that needs to be treated special and careful. So here's what I do. So back to my buckets again. So as you saw, this one was reclaim. The rest of these are glazes, but this one here is my glaze waste. So what I do is I collect it all in this big bucket. And so, whenever I've got a bucket of glazed waste here, I just pour it in. I use my sponge to make sure all of the glaze is out from this bucket, and then I'll go ahead and clean it out again with my cleaning bucket, because I do use the same buckets for throwing. And now we've got a big bucket of glaze, mixed glaze, because I'm using all these different types of glazes. So what do you do with this? Okay, well, you have three options basically, and I've done all three. They're all equally valid. The first option is to let your glaze sink to the bottom, and then you scoop it out. So in the bottom of this is some solids. This is the glaze solids, right? So it basically, gravity filters it out for you, right? So what you can do is you scoop out all of the solids and then bag them up or put them in a bucket or something, and you can take them to the dump. So you don't want to dispose of this in landfill, as I mentioned, but what you can do is you can bring them to the dump and tell them, what you have. And in my experience, they dispose of glazes in the same way that they dispose of paints and like varnishes and stuff. So it's kind of like, I don't actually know what they do with it, but it's like treated separately so that it's not going to leach into nature or whatever. So that's an option. You might have to pay for that, but it's definitely an option. The second option that you can do is you can make like a shallow bowl. So in one of the studios I used to work at, we used to use student bowls that never got picked up. So we would always have like these tiny little, throw-in bowls, and you would do the same thing. You would scoop up the glaze and put it into that little bowl, fill it up almost to the top, and then you put it into the kiln. So basically you have this glaze, like basically a hard rock of glaze that comes out of the kiln. You have to be a little bit careful with this. You don't want to make them too deep, because I have had it happen where it sort of bubbles up and splashes the shelf above it. So they should be really shallow. And this is kind of a tedious way to dispose of your glaze. But if you have a lot of little bowls lying around for whatever reason, you can do it this way. And then the end result piece can be a paperweight. It can just be like an interesting little art object, or you can throw it away. Because at that point, the chemicals will have neutralized in the kiln, they'll be locked in, so you can just then safely throw it away for the landfill. Now, the last option, which is my favorite, is what potters call a mystery glaze. So a mystery glaze is basically you let this fill up halfway with the glaze solids, and then you treat this bucket like a glaze bucket. So you mix it up again with your stir, and you dip pots in it, and you use it as a glaze. And often it becomes a very interesting glaze. Like, you can imagine it's going to be a combination of all your glazes. They're never very vibrant, They're usually a bit like tan or blue or, kind of an off-white. It really depends completely on the glazes that you use. And even if you're using all the same glazes, each time you do a mystery glaze, it's going to end up being a little bit different because of different proportions. So it can be quite fun. We used to do this at my old studio in Berlin, and some of the glazes were really quite beautiful. Now, I do want to mention that there is some debate about whether a mystery glaze is safe for tableware, because you don't have any control about how the chemicals are proportioned in one another. Like, you need to have certain ingredients in proportion when you're mixing up glazes in order to make them stable. So it's very possible that this becomes an unstable glaze, which means it could leach into your food. And because of that, I definitely encourage you to only use this on parts of the pot that are not going to be in contact with food. So you can use them on sculptures, you can use them on vases, you could even use them on the outside of a cup, but you don't want it to be coming in contact with food. Additionally, if you don't like the color at all, you could just use it as a liner glaze. So you use it inside of your vase, the part that's not even going to be able to be seen, and then you use your nice glaze on the outside. And that way you save this glaze, and then you save your nice glazes that you want to use for the outside. So that's what I like to do. This is what we did in my old studio in Berlin, and I've been saving this for a while, and I think my glaze is only up to here. So I have a little ways to go before I can actually use this bucket, but I'll be very curious to see what this turns into when I reveal the mystery glaze. Oh, I should mention, I also use this when I'm glazing. So when I'm mixing my glazes, I use this bucket to clean off my paddle drill. So everything ends up in here. Okay, so finally we are onto my last water system, which is wastewater. So what this is everything else. So I make sure that there's no glazes in here, and any clay water that I know is pure clay water, I'm going to add to the reclaim system. So what this is dirty clay water. It's the water that I've used to clean off my tools. It's the water that I use to clean up splashes of clay. It's the water that I use to wipe down my table, to clean out the extruder. Anything that might not have just clay in it goes in here. So there's dog hair, there's little bits of newspaper, etc. Things that I don't want to add to my reclaim system. That's what I use for my wastewater. And so this is my little cleaning bucket. The wastewater system also includes my mop, because both of these things go into this baby right here. So this is a gravity filter, and it's actually made to be installed in your sink. So this part can go up to the basin of your sink, and the other side can actually go into your wall, like into your drainage system. However, I don't have a sink in my studio, so I've kind of hacked this and just like put a little funnel on top, and that's what I pour my wastewater into. So how this works is it has 3 separate chambers, and the water just kind of overflows into the next chamber. And the water sits long enough in each chamber so that like all the particles and whatever's heavier than water can sink down to the bottom, and all that flows into the next chamber is just the clean water. So at each successive chamber, the water gets cleaner and cleaner till at the very end, the water is basically just clear water. So I do reuse this water sometimes for my mop water. I don't use it for anything else because it is still pretty nasty, it kind of smells. But I use this for my mop water, otherwise I just pour this down the drain. The whole system does get a little smelly. To mitigate the smell, I do sometimes pour alcohol in here, like hand sanitizer alcohol, or some people use vinegar. I've used vinegar before. Some potters like to recommend bleach. I would discourage you from using bleach just because there's some sketchy ethics behind bleach production and use and sustainability factors. So you can use like basically anything that's antibacterial you can use to deal with the smell of this. If you're curious where I got this and you want to buy one of your own, I'll try and find a link for you. But I got this from a German company called Bots, and this is like a pre-made filter. However, you can definitely build your own one of these. It's a very simple process how this works, and there's loads of plans on the internet. So if you want to Google like DIY clay trap or DIY gravity filter, something like that, and you'll find some plans for how to make these. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, it's a very simple thing. But ultimately my goal is to use this as little as possible. So not only cleaning this out is kind of a gross process and I want to avoid it as much as possible, but this is really the only true waste that I generate in the studio. So you can really limit yourself. Like I only change out my cleaning bucket once every couple of days. Like I wait until the water gets pretty thick before I dump it out, and my mop water I clean out maybe once a month. The thing is, if you squeeze out your sponge, even if this water is quite dirty, you can wipe any surface down and it's gonna get it clean. So you can wait till this water gets kind of thick. I mean, eventually it gets a little smelly, so then I throw it out. But yeah, just reuse your bucket. And yeah, if you're trying to limit the amount of water waste you have in the studio, it definitely helps not to have a sink. So all of these techniques I did develop before in Berlin when I did have a sink, because I was simply just trying to limit the amount of wastewater that I make. So I always teach students to wash their tools in a bucket and not in the sink, because you can use a lot of water if you are cleaning your tools while the water is running. I really discourage you from doing that because it's just wasteful. There's no reason to do it that way. This works perfectly fine. So yeah, anyway, these are my water systems. I hope that that was helpful for you. If I missed anything, please write it down below because I think I covered everything, but if not, maybe I can add it to my reclaim video. And otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. I think the next video is actually going to be a slab building video. If I have the pieces done in time, I'm gonna put that in between this video and the reclaim video. So stay tuned for that. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Bye, friends.